Hello, everyone. Hello. Oh, here you all are. You're all appearing on my screen now. Hello. My name is Lee Randall, and I want to welcome you all to Wigtown Wednesdays. Tonight, I'll be talking to Sally Magnusson, the respected writer and broadcaster. But before we do that, I'd like to start off with some housekeeping. So everyone is muted except Sally and I. That way we don't have too much of a three-ring circus. But there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you just scroll down, you'll see it'll pop up. You can use that to ask questions. At the end of the event, as with every book festival event, we will get through as many of the questions as we can. I can't promise all of them, but I'll read them out to Sally and we'll get to them. You'll also notice two links in the chat box. One will take you to the donations page. If you're able to support Wigtown Book Festival with a donation, large or small, that'll help us keep the content coming. There's also a Support Us banner on their website's homepage, should you prefer to do that. The other chat box, really importantly, will take you to our bookshop, where you can buy a copy of Sally's new novel, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I know you're going to want to. By the end of this hour, you're going to be pressing that button so hard. And I'll tell you why. First, I'll just quickly introduce Sally. She began her career in print, then moved to the BBC to present shows such as Reporting Scotland, BBC Breakfast Time, Panorama, and Songs of Praise. She wrote a memoir about her mother's dementia, which was called Where Memories Go. And on the back of that, founded a charity called Playlist for Life, which makes connections, it encourages making connections via personal music playlists for people with dementia, but now also anyone who's feeling isolated during the current lockdown. It's a great way to reach out to one another and bring up memories and just bond. Her debut novel was called The Seal Woman's Gift. It was a Zoe Ball book club pick, and it was shortlisted for a number of prizes, got rave reviews everywhere. The new novel is called The Ninth Child, and it mixes folklore with some forgotten history, and it explores social issues about public health and gender inequality that are surprisingly as relevant today as they were then. It's set in Glasgow and in Loch Katrine in the mid-19th century, when they were building the waterworks there that would provide Glasgow with pure water. So welcome, Sally. Thank you for doing this with us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's very exciting.
I wonder if you would start us off with a reading that would give us the flavor of the book.
Oh, you want to go right ahead? Okay.
Well, because then I can just start pestering you with questions. I have loads of questions.
Okay, well, it's always quite a good idea to start with something close to the beginning. When I wrote my first novel and I did my first sort of public event, I managed to give away the whole plot within the first 5 minutes. So I will now, I'll start right at the beginning of the book and just do, actually the first 3 chapters are very, very short, just a sort of page each, and they introduce us to the 3 different voices of the novel. So this is the first chapter. Alexander should have warned her. Explosions, Izzy, he might have said. Puddles, he could have mentioned. Grass of a less manicured variety than the Botanic Gardens. Pronounced absence of paths wider than the dress. A hint would have been helpful. Had he warned her? This morning's compliment on the strawberry bonnet had been, on reflection, a shade less than sincere, but no, nothing had been said. She would have paid attention to that much. Isabel sank majestically onto a hummock of grass, which is the only way a descent from the upright can be accomplished in a crinoline, and looked around. There were men everywhere, navvies distinguishable by their gay neckerchiefs and hobnail boots, sauntering about with armfuls of ironmongery or leading the most enormous horses along the shore. Gentlemen guests whooping themselves hoarse around a vast corporation of Glasgow banner, each boom accompanied by a frenzied waving of hats. By now, Alexander would probably be hollering right along with them. As the only lady for miles, and certainly the only woman braving the wilds today in a hooped lilac gown and a bonnet nodding with silken fruit, Isabel had been attracting so much attention that she barely noticed the other figure staring at her from a clump of bright trees. She might not have registered him at all. Black coat, something white at the neck, no hat of any kind, if she'd not been so struck by the man's eyes, which burned through the faint gunpowder haze with a peculiar energy. Hungry is how she would describe the look afterwards. Poor fellow, her husband would murmur, we need to find him work. Alexander was not easily engaged with a metaphor. The man was quickly gone, and Isabel, hot and disgruntled in her billow of skirts, had no more inkling of peril than a twinge of anxiety for her strawberries. There was certainly nothing to alert her that here on the banks of hidden Lochon was a beginning, or that this sunny May morning would ever remain for her a kind of ending too. And then chapter 2 is another voice. Out, out, I'm out, the earth erupting in thunder and fire, out, smoke drifting across the heavens, out. A lady, attired in a fine gown and egregiously silly bonnet. I hear you, I see her. Robert Kirk is out of fairy, and one glance is enough. And do you want just a little bit of Kirsty McEachern is the other voice in the book? Just start at the beginning, you say. Tell it your own way, Kirsty McEachern, and forget who's listening. But see, beginnings, endings. It's not always easy to know which is which. Life's a circular sort of thing most of the time, and so's a story. Those of us at the heart of this one would likely all tell you differently where it began, and as for where it ended, well, is it even finished yet? That's what I ask myself sometimes. It's a long while since I've spoken about Robert Kirk, but maybe it's time. Maybe it's time right enough. I'm the one who knew Isabel Laird best in those years, unless you're counting her husband, and there were times I wasn't so sure you should. And I'm the one who warned her. Mrs. Laird says I be careful. I've got a feeling about this man. I get these feelings. When you grow up in the Highlands and Islands with Gaelic, your first tongue, you come away with an instinct for things that are that bit beyond what you might call the natural, though to us it's all one. You see what can exactly be seen in the names our ancestors gave to the hills and the hollows and the brown peat moors and the ancient mounds of the Sheath. That's fairies to you. English never quite catches the idea of any of it. Nor, to be honest with you, did Isabel Laird. You have to remember she was a lowlander, born and bred in a city. What did she know about matters that Highlanders drink in with their mother's milk? She thought they were no more than a quaint thing to read about in those fancy books that brought tourists to ooh and ah at the landscape of the Trossachs. There she came, all innocent, with her parasol a twirl, and a background that had bred her useless. Broken inside though, awful broken. A woman like that has no defences.
Well, thank you. You know, when I read those first 3 chapters, I just sat back and I said, right, I'm in the hands of an expert. This is going to go well. And I hope everyone listening got that same sense of it. I'm so impressed by this book. I want to know more about Robert Kirk. Let's start with him. I want to sort of run through all the different characters and all the voices, because every novel represents a collection of decisions that the writers made. And it says in the flaps on the book that he was one of your inspirations, and yet you didn't choose to make him. It's not a book about him per se. So I'm curious to know who he was, what he inspired you, and why he isn't the central character in the book.
Well, there's a lot of questions there.
Yes,
Robert Kirk was a 17th century minister, Episcopalian minister, actually, at a time when Scotland's religious allegiances were changing backwards and forwards a lot. The second half of the 17th century, it was a very sort of turbulent time. But he was a very sort of interesting, thoughtful, very tolerant for the times minister who was born in Aberfoyle and grew up there under his father, who was a minister there. Then he went off to university in Edinburgh and St Andrews, and he studied divinity, became a minister at Balquhidder, north of Aberfoyle in the Trossachs, was there for many, many years. And you can go to Balquhidder to this day and see the wonderful bell that he had forged when he left Balquhidder. Mm-hmm. And it's got a beautiful inscription on it, which is love and life, which is I think quite an extraordinary thing to hear coming out of the mouth of a 17th century Scottish minister. It sounds actually very, very modern. And there was much that was actually, looking back on it, rather sort of modern about Robert Kirk. He was an extremely tolerant person. He believed that the religious views at either end of the divide were too extreme and had lost sight of actually what the central focus of their religion should be. And he was also very interested in his parishioners, in the Gaelic-speaking mainly congregation who had supernatural beliefs that were very common in Scotland at the time and had been for a very long time, which were about the fairies and all sorts of hidden people to whom one got access through certain people who had been sort of chosen, as it were, as seers who could see into the deep things and the deep places. And he was interested in this. He had an antiquarian mind, really, and he went about collecting stories and writing them down. And just before he died, he had put together a collection of stories and beliefs and superstitions about fairies, fauns, elves, brownies, you name it. And it was called The Secret Commonwealth. It was published posthumously, but he died in 1692 in what was thought of afterwards as mysterious circumstances. He walked up Doon Hill near his Aberfoyle manse, Kirkton and Aberfoyle, which was considered which was something that he did very often. It was his sort of normal evening stroll, but he was found dead on the hill one night. Now, the poor man probably had a heart attack or a stroke, mm-hmm. But the legend grew that he had actually been snatched by the fairies on Doon Hill, which means the hill of the fairies in Gaelic, and was punished for getting, putting his nose in their business, trying to find out too much about them and collecting this book and so on. And this was a story that was popularised by that great populariser of Scottish myth, Walter Scott, many years later. And so Robert Kirk to this day is remembered as the fairy minister, the man who was stolen away by the fairies. And unfortunately, his great achievements as an antiquarian, as a very thoughtful, tolerant, interesting figure, have been rather submerged in this legend that grew after his death. The legend being also that he came back. He came back from imprisonment with the fairies and did various things. Now, I have somewhat to my own shame, I sometimes think I've perpetuated the legendary side of Robert Kirk, because I just thought it was such a great story that there's this Scottish minister imprisoned in a tree in Doon Hill, and what would happen if he came back. And that's what got my sort of storytelling vibe going. Mm-hmm. But I also thought, what would happen if he happened to come back, not in his own time, not indeed in our time, But at the time of the building of the Loch Katrine waterworks in the middle of the 19th century, when the earth was being thrown up to make this wonderful, great tunnel that was being sent from Loch Katrine to Glasgow to carry life-giving water, what would happen if Robert Kirk appeared at that time? And that was the premise of the book.
But what a great leaping off point. Now,
There's a lot of leaping off goes on in this book.
yes, there is that. I have to say, I have a vague memory when we did an event about the Seal Woman's Gift that we talked about fairies then as well, because of your father's belief and the Icelandic belief in fairies. So I'm guessing this is something very much bred in the bone for you with your, between Scotland and Iceland. The fairies aren't going away.
I suppose it must be. I'm just so fascinated by folklore. I mean, I love history, real history, as it were, and that's why I've found such joy in writing historical novels. But I do think that the folklore, the beliefs of a people, whether they are disregarded in a later era as superstition, is part of history. It's part of us, and it's written. The beliefs of the Gaels and the Celtic peoples are written in our place names, and when you go to the Trossachs, which is quite close to where I live, north of Glasgow, and it's very, very easy to reach, and yet the names there take you immediately back to olden times. Now, of course, that's the case much more so in the Hebrides and in the Highlands. But I was interested in the Trossachs because it's very much the sort of dividing line between lowlands and highlands. It's kind of known as a sort of thin place, where you can see the collision of ancient and modern. Mm-hmm. And again, that was what I was interested in, the modern, as modernity was in the middle of the 19th century, with this great thrust of engineering progress that was happening, of fertility of ideas and innovation and experiment and discovery, but coexisting in the Trossachs side by side with these ancient beliefs that are so very, very interesting and tell us so much about people who lived at that time, their fears, the fears about having if you having a deformed child. How do you explain that? How do you possibly explain, children disappearing, children dying, children being born deformed? Oh, it's the fairies, and you understand so much through a people's folklore, as indeed Robert Kirk himself understood, and that's why he wanted to find out more about it.
And is it not the case that there's a tribute to him up on Doon Hill? Don't people leave things on a tree, or
yes, a bit new agey, yes, and people have gone up there and left coins and ribbons, and I find it all a bit spooky, actually. I don't like the atmosphere there very much, but I think possibly that's just because I scare myself silly thinking about the fact that I might be abducted at any moment by fairies.
That's so interesting, because I grew up in America with fairy tales. So apart from the angry ones, usually you think of like a fairy godmother. So I tend to think of fairies as more benevolent than not. But then I moved to Scotland and I realized people have a whole other vision about fairies.
Yeah,
slightly edgier.
Yeah, I mean they can be good and bad, but they can be quite malign. And as indeed are the Icelandic, the Icelandic ones are the serious business,
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to work my way through your characters. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert appear in the book, and they are not observed. They are experienced. You bring them to life. They have conversations. They speak. We are in Albert's head sometimes. That's a decision. Why did you decide to treat them in that manner?
Oh, I was just having fun.
It is fun.
I mean, Victoria and Albert came, I mean, people will be listening to this wondering how on earth all this fits together. But it fits together because Robert Kirk lived in Aberfoyle, which is not far from Loch Katrine and Loch On, where the great Glasgow waterworks built by the Corporation of Glasgow to feed clean water to Glasgow were being built in the middle of the 19th century. And that's where, you know, most of the action of the book takes place. But they were opened in 1859 by Queen Victoria and Albert, who had been having their annual holiday in Balmoral, and they came down to Edinburgh and then to Callander and then to Loch Katrine to open the waterworks in what was an amazing day for Scotland, and an amazingly wet day as well. And so that is, and that's not sort of a spoiler to say that you know, comes into the book at one point. But as I began to think about Albert and Victoria and how I would, you know, just technically get them there and bring them in there, they would either have to be just a sort of walk-on part, reported probably by one of the other characters, or more interestingly, I felt I could actually give them a presence, you know, leading up to that. And I gave myself that permission because Queen Victoria, as is well known, was an extremely fecund Victorian mother who kept, you know, giving birth to children that it's pretty clear she would rather not have had. You know, she wanted the sex, but she wasn't very keen on what came out the other end, as it were. At the same time as I'm also dealing, as one of the major themes of the book, with what happened to Victorian women, Victorian middle-class women who could not have children, whose role in life was practically only to have children. If you to be a wife and mother was just about all you were allowed to be. And what would happen if you couldn't be that?
Yeah, there's a beautiful mirroring and compare and contrast, because let's talk about Isabel Laird, who for me is the main focus of the book. I mean, I fell in love with absolutely all the characters, including Victoria and Albert, but Isabel.
Especially Albert was, I was quite fond of Albert. Yes, yeah. Much underestimated man.
And both Albert and Isabel are so funny that I couldn't not love them, because I love people who make me laugh and whose view on life is a bit, you know, jaundiced. And they both have that kind of, that view where they're just a bit like, oh, is that what's happening here? But tell us about Isabel, the doctor's wife, the woman at the center of the book.
Well, Isabel Laird is an invented character. I mean, I have taken liberties with real historical personages. There was a doctor who was appointed to the Loch Katrine waterworks. Fortunately, I couldn't find out anything about him. And I say fortunately because once you have found out something historical, this is my sort of personal kind of way of doing things, I can't then flout it. I can't turn it on its head and make it something different. So I did as much research as I could into the Loch Katrine waterworks, learned that there had been a doctor there, but couldn't find out even his name. And it was quite a thing to have appointed a doctor. That was, you know, the Loch Katrine waterworks were such a great civic scheme, you know. It was the ratepayers of Glasgow that had to pay for it all, and you know, it was fairly innovative to have a doctor paid to be there on hand. Many of the private railway projects, for instance, it was a long time before they had such a thing. So, as in any novel where the main character or one of them is a woman, it's always quite difficult actually to find what a plot can do to give a woman agency, because at that time they had so little. And you do find yourself, you know, finding that they're in a place because their husband's there. The story of the book is actually Isabel Laird finding agency of her own, but what got her to Loch Catrin was being the wife of the doctor. And you know, I thought it would be interesting to explore what would happen when a woman, very dissatisfied with her life, you know, not, you know, having successive miscarriages, so not able to throw herself into the motherhood role that was expected of her, but actually she's intelligent, she's not very interested in a lot of the things that she's supposed to be interested in, as a sort of young Victorian matron. What would happen if you took her out of her city and plonked her in the middle of what was, you know, actually at that time, really pretty wild part of Britain, pretty inaccessible. I mean, Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake had begun to make it a tourist mecca, but even, you know, these doughty Victorian tourists had quite a journey to get there, you know, whether it was up Loch Lomond or up Loch Catrin, and a horrendous stagecoach ride to, you know, to get there and to see the sights. And Loch On was even further, where the tunnel went through to, was even more sort of desolate. So she was landing there in a place where there was very little, and it was about to be turned into an industrial wasteland with a camp of hundreds of navvies that they called Sebastopol, because the noise of the explosions reminded them of Sebastopol in the Crimea, where many of them had returned from quite recently as veterans. So that's Isabel Laird, and she has, you know, as you might expect, she has an encounter then with this strange character who we, the reader, know is somewhat improbably Robert Kirk, but it takes her a while to find out, and she's busy trying to deal with a lot of the questions that have been thrown up by where she finds herself.
You use her, in addition to talking about what role a woman has. For me, there were very pointed messages about class. So on the one hand, we, you know, the fecundity, we have Queen Victoria, who's having all these children, wanted or unwanted. We have Isabel, who's a middle class or upper middle class woman who's supposed to be genteel and lovely. And then we have Kirsty, who's working class, she's poor, she's had loads of children, and she even makes the point that, you know, she gives birth to a child and then goes and has to go put on a wash, and that doesn't mean going to her washing machine, that means like scrubbing knee deep in the river. And for me, there was a big message about the perception of class, women of different classes, as if they were of different species.
Yeah, as they pretty much were. Yes, indeed. And I was, you know, although I was, I became very fond of the Victoria and Albert characters that I created, and there was a sort of, you know, I was enjoying myself, and there was a kind of playfulness about the way I approached their characterization. At the same time, you know, they were playing at being Highlanders, you know, up there in Balmoral, and, you know, wearing their kilts or their tartan dresses. Queen Victoria was very disappointed when she went to the local church on her first Sunday up there. It was a place they loved. They really felt it was their home, and they built it up there. But to find that none of the locals were wearing kilts, you know, it was a Highland sort of idyll that she was creating there at the very same time as Highlanders were still being evicted from their homes by, one has to say, the same sort of class as Victoria and Albert were part of, you know, in order to have the great improvement that, in inverted commas, that was behind the Highland clearances. And Highlanders were streaming down to places like Glasgow in search of work. You know, others were emigrating, and others were, you know, various things happened. And I'm not here to sort of be, you know, sort of glib about the Highland clearances, because I know there are pros and cons to a lot of the social side of that, but it was a very, very traumatic change for many of the people from the Highlands and the islands who lost their homes. And I got a slight glimpse of that through my mother's grandmother, who I didn't know, of course, and she knew until my mother was about 5 years old. Her grandmother died, but her grandmother had been a girl on Mull, and she told the story of her father's croft, turf house on Mull, from which the family were evicted. And the way they were evicted in the end was their cow was taken away from them. They kept, I think they kept ignoring the removal notices, as many did, because they had nowhere to go. And eventually their cow was taken away from them. And the great family story was that they looked out the window the next morning and found the cow had walked all the way back, had swum from the island that she'd been put on, and swum all the way back to the family croft in Ardmore on Mull. But my grandmother told this story to her son, who passed it on to my mother. And my mother, it went very deep. My mother used to say she remembered her grandmother crying, singing her Gaelic songs and crying for her home in Mull. And she told me this story, and I found it so fascinating that when I eventually had time, I did a genealogical search, and I found the croft or where it had been in Ardmore, and I traced that little girl who, at the age of 13, family was evicted, and she was sent down to Glasgow, and she got on the boat. She arrived in Glasgow at the age of 13. Found somehow a big house in Glasgow where she was taken on as a maid, and she worked as a maid in Glasgow, and then she married a joiner, and then she had 4 boys with him. Her husband and 3 of the boys died of TB. I mean, it was hard life.
Yeah.
And she became a washerwoman after her husband died. She took in laundry to try and live. And I got a sense through her of what it was like for real. That was the 1850s. The clearances came quite late to Mull, 1850s and 1860s for her. But that's what I had in mind when I was creating the character of Kirsty McEachern. In her case, her husband comes to Glasgow, or comes south to look for work, and finds work as a navvy on the railways, as some did, and then he comes to Lochcatron, and that's why she's there. And she forges something of a friendship with Isabel, Isabel's been shaken out of her kind of social strata by coming out. You know, she's everything's been kind of thrown up, and she takes a lot of back chat from Kirsty that she probably wouldn't anywhere else. But I wanted to see I'm interested in collisions always. I'm interested in sort of bringing different opposites up against each other, whether it's folklore and social realism, or a queen and an abbey, or whatever, and seeing how I can get them to interact in ways that are vaguely plausible.
Yeah. And Kirsty's just such an inviting voice, because the way you've got it in the book, she's telling this story to someone. It's just as if she's got her arm around the back of my chair and she's whispering in my ear, and it's lovely. It's just a lovely way to get the story told to me.
Oh, well, I'm glad you think that works. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think
you write this stuff and then you get no idea at the end of it whether it's worked or not. So
yeah. Let's just to circle back. One of the issues, of course, is Isabel's had, in 7.5 years of marriage, she's lost 8 babies at different stages of her pregnancies, and for her it's made her numb. It's not giving anything away to say that her emotions are very much kept under a lid, because she can't allow herself to feel. And it brought home to me that thing that we tend to forget, that because infant and child mortality was more common, or the perception is it was more common, then we tend to forget that it was no less painful, that the grief was no less present for these men and women than it is for anyone nowadays.
Yeah.
And again, I thought that you brought that home very poignantly.
Because that is what connects us. That's what connects us to the past, and it is often very difficult to excavate the lives of women, because they, so often did not have a voice, did not have access to, possibilities to do the things that made history. And I'm fascinated by their lives. I'm fascinated to try and find out what their lives were and what I can't find out to imagine my way into. And the way that I imagine my way into their lives is by thinking that human beings, by and large, don't change. They
not emotionally
really change. Motherhood is motherhood always. And I can't believe that just because babies died often, that the pain was ever any less. You learn how to bear the pain. You learn how to live through it, because you have to. But the human heart is the same, and that's why I love. Actually, it's why I love historical novels. Reading historical novels. It's what Hilary Mantel does so brilliantly with her characters, is take you into human beings who have not, in essence, changed very much at all.
Yeah. Well, I always think that's why art works. That's why art touches us, because through the years, whether it's a cave painting or it's an impressionist, or art works because, as you say, the human heart remains the same. It's just, our gadgets are different. Our stuff is different. But you do bring in 2 more, one tangentially and one very vividly, 2 more real women who did not live the kind of life Isabel is living, Florence Nightingale and Agnes Lister. Can you talk a little bit about including them in the book and who they were? I mean, obviously, Florence Nightingale, I think people will know who she is, but not for the reason that you chose to put her in, I believe.
Yes, although I don't want to give away too much, but what interested me in reading up on Florence Nightingale was a couple of things. I liked the fact that she had visited Balmoral at one of the times in which Queen Victoria was there, and I actually needed her to be there for the plot. And there's these lovely moments when you're researching things and you think, oh yes, that's great. I can use that without having to offend against history too much. And she was there so soon after she came back from the Crimea. explaining, to the royal couple what happened. And they were very, 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 very supportive of her. But also, what I didn't realize was, of course, I knew about her work as a nurse and her pioneering, and indeed about some of her writings. I didn't realize that she had been quite as outspoken as she was about the lives of women. That she felt that women were not, given the chance to stretch themselves, to use their brains and their minds, to have jobs. And she wrote a searing essay called Cassandra in the 1850s, where she talked. She's actually quite amusing, talking about the ghastliness of having to do some of the things that ladies are expected to do. I think she talked about sitting in a reading circle, hearing, they had all to sort of sit and read out from a book, and she said it was like having burning oil poured down her throat. And so that was interesting, because that fitted, well with what I was trying to explore through Isabel Laird.
Mm. And Anne Lister, just very briefly, was Joseph Lister's wife.
Oh yes, Agnes Lister.
Oh, sorry, Agnes.
Yeah, I mean Joseph Lister, well known for his discoveries, his medical discoveries. Less well known was the fact that at his side, all the way through, was his wife Agnes, who was helping him with the researches and writing up his notes. And I mean, Joseph Lister is not known for his help at all of women trying to make their way in the profession. The very opposite, actually. And interesting to find out how much he was actually relying on the woman at his side. And they didn't have any children either. And so that interested me. That was her way of, she found a role for herself, but she never got any credit for it. I don't think anybody. I certainly didn't know her name really, or what she had contributed to his work.
Yeah, I'm just going to tell the listeners that we have just over 15 minutes left, so feel free to visit the chat box and put in some questions, or hit one of the links to make a donation or buy the book. I have loads more questions, but we want your questions as well. One of the things that struck me was the exploration of, I was trying to decide, sometimes you give yourself these between a rock and a hard place questions. As I was reading, I was like, which is worse, rural poverty in the 1800s or urban poverty? And my God. So Kirsty's living pretty bare bones in a house that's been carved out of the side of the hill. But her sister in Glasgow, that scene in Glasgow, which I'm not going to spoil for anyone listening, I'm never going to forget that. It made my skin crawl, Sally. It was so disturbing. And I presume, knowing you, that it's based in fact.
Yeah, it is. The housing at that time, in the 1850s, was dreadful. The tenements were just filling up with people who were cramming into the city from the Highlands, from Ireland. I mean, there was the potato famine had come, not long before that. There was all sorts of reasons why people were having to leave their rural homes and come to the city. And that decade also began to see, by the end of it, the birth of public health, of which we're so conscious of today. But that was when it was just beginning to start, understanding that housing, water, all these things had to be thought about if you were going to try and have a healthier, more productive population. But some of the scenes, some of the conditions in which people were forced to live were absolutely appalling. I mean, I know even by the 1930s, when my mother was growing up in the borough of Rutherglen, just borders on Glasgow. I mean, the poverty she was living in at that time, and always would say there was worse around her. Was really quite severe, and things had improved immeasurably by that time.
Yeah. Well, that brings us back to you did extensive research into the waterworks and Scottish Water. There's a very funny point in the author's notes afterwards where you have to beg forgiveness of your family for dragging them around. Anytime you even turn on the tap, they start to freak out. No, she's doing it again. Tell us a little bit about your research, please.
Well, the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, as it's called now, is just a great favourite haunt of mine. It's in normal times, it's a lovely place to go. At almost any season, and just tramp around. And it's a place where I used to take the children quite a lot when they were younger. And as I got more and more interested in the waterworks, I would be saying, "Come on, we've got to follow this aqueduct. there's a flash of it over there. Come with me," and the poor kids were following on, dragging their heels, and there's a sluice, and now let me show you what happens there. And they began to dread the inevitable sort of call to get in the car and let's drive to Loch Katrine. But that was where my research, if you want to call it that, I mean, it was very light at that point. It was just me interested. It's just such a fantastic work of engineering. And it was described at the time as the greatest engineering work since the aqueducts of Rome. It's phenomenal, really, when you see it. I mean, they were drilling through some of the hardest rock on earth, certainly at the northern end, with what was basically hammer and chisel. They'd do some gunpowder, and then they'd have these long sort of jumper poles, and that somebody would bang it into the rock, and they went for miles like that. It's astonishing achievement, and what it achieved in Glasgow, which was to save them from the next cholera epidemic, and help the public health movement to get on its way there was amazing. So really my research was going there, enjoying it, being interested in it, looking it up, trying to find newspaper articles, and just as much as I could get from mainly the Mitchell Library in Glasgow.
So you had all these different elements. You had your minister and your fairy legend. You had the waterworks. You had the idea of women's lack of agency. When did you realize they were all that they could all work together and make a story? When did you decide to bring them all into the room together?
I don't know. There was never a moment. I think the two elements that I thought would work together would be the waterworks and Robert Kirk, because they are physically quite close to each other. They're only a few miles away, Aberfoyle and the Loch Katrine and Loch On. Mm-hmm. I don't know really. I just see. I've come to novel writing quite late in life, and so the thing that drives me is sort of that I have to enjoy myself. Do you know what I mean? I need to be able to use this as a way of learning, of engaging, of learning not just about history, but learning about a craft, learning how to put a novel together, how to work with voices, how to play with tone, all that sort of thing. So for me, it was important just to find ways that would interest myself enough, and hope that in interesting myself, I would do it well enough to interest readers. Mm-hmm. So I thought, I love Loch Catrin. I love this story. I really would quite enjoy spending the time that it will take to find out more about this. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, up in Doon Hill, there's a completely different story. There's this astonishing, folklorish element, which, wouldn't it be interesting if I brought these two how could I bring these two together? What would happen if? And it nearly always starts as a what would happen if. So, in they come. And I sort of gallop off trying to bring these two together. And then there's Victoria and Albert. And I'm thinking, Victoria and Albert, there's all sorts of parallels, and it's like a tapestry. You begin to see how you could weave that in and weave another thing in. And there's another character that I love from history called McCorn Rankin, who's a professor of engineering in Glasgow University, who was one of these tremendous sort of Renaissance men, of the time, when they can do everything. They're building waterworks and railways and canals, and he's making amazing discoveries about thermal whatsits and pistons and all sorts of things. And at the same time, he's composing songs, and he's playing the piano, and he's playing the cello, and he's writing poetry, and he's also a great big sort of bluff, hearty character of immense good humour. And I thought, I discovered him in the course of finding out about the waterworks, and I thought, it'd be nice if I could get him in. And then I thought, there's absolutely no way I can get him in. And then I discovered, learning about the opening of the waterworks, that Queen Victoria had a bodyguard of volunteers, the first of the volunteer movement in Glasgow. And who was it led by in his spare time? William McCorn Rankin. So I thought, that's it. That's my way into him. Yeah.
Let me go. There are two good questions here. One is, hearing your comments about Doon Hill and being abducted by fairies, I wondered how spiritual a person you are. That's from Pauline.
Oh, I'm as I said, I'm interested in folklore. I'm interested in realities beyond the quotidian. I always think there is more. There is more to life than we sometimes give it credit for, and yeah.
Another one says, another one's asking, as a journalist, having been a journalist, how liberating is the freedom to make stuff up?
Oh, very liberating, yes. Very liberating. It took me a while to feel fully liberated. It was certainly with my first novel, it took me a few goes before I let go of being a reporter. And now I'm so liberated. Now I put words into Queen Victoria's mouth, and I have McCorn Rankin meeting Robert Kirk, and all sorts of things going on. So it's the liberation's clearly gone to my head, but I do enjoy it. Yeah.
And last question from Shona. She says, having just read The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, fabulous book, which follows the lives of the victims of Jack the Ripper and the appalling imbalance for Victorian women, given that we had a queen on the throne, why do you think that women's rights were so poor, despite the fact that there was a female monarch at the time?
Well, I don't think Queen Victoria ever saw her job as to help liberate other women in any way. Although I do think that she felt the constraints of her womanhood. You know, the fact that she had to keep having children, and every time she got pregnant, I mean, she was ill beforehand and she was ill after, and Albert more or less ran the country for years while she was busy doing it. But I don't think that she really saw her job in any way as to sort of bring on other women. And it was a time, it really was a severely constrained time for women. I mean, more so it was, I don't think there's just been a sort of chronology of, you know, women getting more and more and more freedoms. The middle of the Victorian age was a particular time, or the Victorian age generally really was a time when the constraint of doing things as they should be seen by other people, you know, the Dickens who was guilty of a lot of this himself, I may say, but he was also very good at putting his finger on so much that was wrong with Victorian Britain. He had a wonderful couple in Our Mutual Friend, which is one of, I think, his best novel, but they're called the Veneerings, you know, and so you can imagine what they're, you know, everything is about veneer. And he's Dickens, being Dickens, he's very funny about it, but it was lethal at that time for women. It was all about how you were seen, how you were perceived, the image of the family, of motherhood, of propriety, of what you could say and how you looked and what you. This was middle-class women. Again.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a class issue again.
Absolutely not the same for the Kirsty McKecherns, who just did everything. But I think it just was very hard. And it was people like Florence Nightingale and others, and there were women there that trod a sort of lonely path of getting things done and getting things changed. And by the end of the century, it was moving. But I haven't read that book. I've heard great things about it.
Oh, Sally, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's amazing.
Yeah. Next on the list.
Excellent. Well, listen.
After I finish Hilary Mantel, which may take me several months.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. This is normally when I ask the audience to give you a round of applause. So instead, what I'm going to say is, everyone, you might want to click on the link and buy this book. I will give you a round of applause. Thank you so much. I loved reading the book. I've loved talking to you about it. And thank you for starting us off on Wigtown Wednesdays.
Oh, Lee, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.